In this section, we learn about Corona materials and maps, and for the first few lessons, we'll be covering the most important and the most frequently used material in Corona, which is Corona material. We'll be using this shader ball scene from masteringcgi.com.au. I have converted the scene to Corona and adjusted it a bit to make it more suitable. From the Corona menu in the materials window, we can see all the Corona materials, including Corona hair material, Corona skin material, Corona light material, and so on. We are interested in this Corona material, which is the Uber shader in Corona. If I open up Node Material Editor and right click in this working area, from the new material submenu, we can access all the Corona materials. Also under new shader plugins and Corona, you notice we have a bunch of specific Corona maps like ambient occlusion, color correct, triplanar, and so on. For now, let's add a new Corona material and assign it to our shader ball. You can simply do that by dragging and dropping the material editor preview on the right side to the shader ball geometry. And you see when we create this new material in the node editor, the same material has become available in the materials window down here as well, so we can assign it to the geometry right from here as well. Corona material is the most powerful and versatile material in Corona, capable of producing almost all types of real-world shaders and materials, from water to plastic, glass, wood, concrete, metals, and much more. If you take a look at the Corona material, you notice it has different sections: diffuse, reflection, refraction, opacity, translucency, displacement, volumetrics, bump, and so on. Combining these parameters makes it possible to create almost any shader using this material. In this video, we talk about the diffuse and translucency section of the Corona material. By default, only the diffuse section is available, and we can enable other sections as we need them. So let's run the interactive rendering and see what we get. In the diffuse section, the first parameter that we have is the diffuse color. This is the base color of your material. You can choose a simple color or use a map. If you are creating, for example, a red plastic shader, you would choose red as your diffuse color. Or if you are creating a wood shader, you would use a wood texture as your diffuse color. So I can choose any color as the diffuse color, and this way control the very base color of the material. Or if you click on this texture slot, you can choose a map as your diffuse color. You can also use most of Cinema 4D native procedural maps like noise or gradient. So let's click on this button. In this case, let's select this wood parquet V02 as our map. And it appears on our shader as our diffuse color. Also in the working area, you can see now a bitmap node containing our wood texture has been connected to the diffuse map. Let's for now keep this texture, and instead of this mid-gray color, use a greenish color for our diffuse color. Another interesting thing that you can do is to mix and match between your diffuse color and your diffuse map. Right now we have this green color as a diffuse color and this wood texture as a diffuse map. If you come down to this mixed strength value, this is the magic number to be used if you wish to mix between your diffuse map and diffuse color. Right now it's set to 100%, so only the texture will be used. If I set this number to 0, only the color will be used, and if set to 50%, 50% of the texture and 50% of the color will be used. Let's set it back to 100% for now. You can also use different mix mode or blending modes like normal, add, subtract, multiply, and colorize to blend between the color you have chosen and the texture that you have selected, which can be very useful in certain situations. We have this diffuse level parameter that acts as a multiplier for the diffuse color or the diffuse texture. if you have defined one, obviously. So if it's set to 100%, you will be using 100% of the defined color or texture RGB values. And if I start to decrease the value, you notice we get darker and darker diffuse contribution. For now, let's set it to 100%. Now let's clear the map for the time being. Instead of this green color, I'm gonna reset it to the default color. Before moving on, I want to briefly talk about the importance of not using too white, or better to say, too bright diffuse colors. We have a concept called albedo, which in the realm of shaders and materials indicates the overall brightness of your material. Albedo is the reflecting power of a material. In Corona, it is the sum of materials' diffuse, reflective, refractive, and translucent components. If we consider the value of 0 as pure black and 100% as pure white, the whitest of whites in real world probably will be represented by a value like 85 to 90%, like a very, very white snow. But for a normal white, for something like a white interior wall or a white cabinet in the kitchen, you don't need to increase this value to more than 70% or 75% at most. Using very bright values as your diffuse color, especially for large interior surfaces like an interior wall, will make the render to be much slower, much noisier, completely washed out, and unrealistic. So at all costs, avoid using higher values than 75 or 80% in most cases. For special surfaces, as I mentioned, you can approach, something like 90%. There is a way in Corona to detect if you have used the wrong diffuse color, a diffuse color that is just too white and unrealistic. If you open up Corona multipass window, under the shading passes, there is a pass called albedo. Let's add this and make sure multipass rendering is enabled. And change the diffuse color value to something like 100% white. And start the render. First of all, you notice the surface is just way too white and reflects all the incoming lights diffusely. If you go to the albedo pass, we get this red warning color that tells us that the diffuse value for this material is just way too high and will cause problems in terms of realism and render efficiency. But if I start decreasing the value to 90 and 80%, that red color turns into a light gray color that tells us we are good to go. Let's stop the render and set the value to the default 70% mid-gray as our diffuse color. Now let's talk about the translucency section of the Corona material. If we enable the translucency and go to the translucency tab, translucency allows you to simulate translucent surfaces that allows light rays to go through them. Paper, leaf would be good examples. If I just stop the render and hide this shader ball for a moment and create a cube, set its size to something like 40 centimeters and move it, rise it up a bit, and add a Corona light right inside that box. I'm gonna make sure the light is spherical with the radius of 5 centimeters and assign the Corona material to the box. And if we run the interactive rendering right now, with the translucency fraction set to 0%, the surface won't allow the light rays to pass through it. But if we increase the translucency fraction value to 20%, Now we see how the surface is glowing, indicating there is a light inside the box. And if we increase the translucency fraction value to, let's say, 50%, you notice that effect gets extenuated. And using the color value, you can control the color of the translucency, or what color the light rays will turn into when translucency is happening. For example, if it's used for a leaf material, you need to change this color to a green color, or obviously a green leaf texture. And this can be very useful for simulating very thin translucent materials like, as I mentioned, leaf or paper. For now, let's stop the render and hide the box and unhide the shader ball, and turn off or delete the light, and make sure the translucency color is set to its default. Another thing translucency does is to control how much volumetric scattering we want in the material. If I enable volumetrics and SSS section, we have two subsurface scattering modes, volumetric scattering and SSS. We talk extensively about these two modes later on in this section, but if we choose volumetric scattering as our subsurface scattering mode, it doesn't have to do anything with the volumetrics that we talked about in the lighting section of the course. It's a specific subsurface scattering mode here. So if we choose volumetric scattering as our subsurface scattering mode and change the absorption color to, let's say, pink, and distance to something like 8 centimeters, and scattering color maybe to green, in order to allow this volumetric scattering through, we need to increase our translucency fraction accordingly. So if I set my diffuse color, let's say, to blue, when the translucency fraction is set to 0, we only get the diffuse color. And when set to, let's say, 50%, we get a combination of the diffuse and volumetric scattering. And when set to 100%, the diffuse component is gone and we only get volumetric scattering. Perfect. In this lesson, we learned about the diffuse and translucency component of the Corona material. See you in the next lesson.